The avoidance behavior after losing you reveals everything about their attachment wounds, their emotional capacity, and the sophisticated defense mechanisms they employ to avoid confronting the devastating reality that they've destroyed something valuable through their own choices and defensive patterns. Where they turn for comfort, validation, and distraction exposes the depth of their dysfunction and their systematic avoidance of the personal growth that losing you could have catalyzed if they possessed the emotional courage to face themselves honestly. Most people assume the avoidant grieves their loss privately, reflects on their behavior, and eventually pursues personal growth that might prevent future relationship destruction. The brutal reality is that avoidants rarely sit with their feelings long enough to process loss authentically. Instead, they immediately seek external sources of validation, distraction, and ego repair that allow them to avoid the uncomfortable emotions and self-reflection that genuine grief would require from emotionally mature adults. Understanding who they turn to after losing you becomes essential for your healing process because it eliminates romantic fantasies about them suffering appropriately for their choices, recognizing what they lost, or experiencing the emotional devastation that their behavior deserves to create. The avoidance post-relationship behavior typically demonstrates their continued emotional immaturity, their systematic avoidance of accountability, and their desperate need for external validation rather than internal reflection. Their choices about where to seek comfort reveal whether they possess any capacity for genuine growth or whether they simply repeat identical patterns with new people who don't yet understand their emotional limitations and defensive programming. Some avoidants cycle through predictable relationship patterns that demonstrate their inability to learn from failures, while others temporarily embrace solitude before reverting to familiar dysfunction once their immediate discomfort subsides. The people and places they turn to serve specific psychological functions. Some provide ego validation that repairs their wounded self-image. Others offer distraction from uncomfortable feelings about their role in relationship destruction, while still others enable their continued avoidance of the personal work required to develop healthy attachment capacity and authentic, intimate connection with emotionally available partners. Most significantly, their post-relationship choices reveal whether losing you created any genuine psychological impact or whether you simply became another casualty in their long history of relationship destruction that they've learned to navigate without appropriate emotional consequences, meaningful self-reflection, or sustainable behavior change that would prevent identical patterns in future partnerships. Understanding their patterns helps you recognize that their inability to sit with loss, process grief authentically, or engage in meaningful self-reflection has nothing to do with your worth or the relationship's value. Their defensive responses to losing you demonstrate their profound emotional limitations, rather than revealing anything about your significance in their life or your capacity to inspire genuine love and sustained emotional investment. The avoidance journey after losing you typically involves systematic avoidance of the very emotional work that could heal their attachment wounds, repeated pursuit of relationships and connections that require nothing challenging from them, and continued reliance on external validation, rather than developing the internal resources that healthy adults require for psychological stability and authentic human connection. Their choices ultimately reveal that they will continue suffering and creating suffering until they develop the courage to face themselves honestly, process their attachment trauma authentically, and commit to the difficult personal growth that genuine healing requires from someone whose defensive patterns have consistently destroyed their most important relationships and prevented them from experiencing the love and connection they unconsciously crave but systematically avoid through sophisticated psychological defenses. The ex who never left their back pocket. The avoidant's first instinct after losing you involves returning to previous relationships that they never properly ended, reconnecting with ex-partners who represent familiar emotional territory that requires no vulnerability or risk of genuine attachment. These backup connections have been carefully maintained through sporadic communication, occasional check-ins, and strategic ambiguity about whether their past relationship truly ended or simply paused indefinitely, while they explored other options that might provide satisfaction without requiring uncomfortable vulnerability. This X represents psychological safety through familiarity, someone who already knows their emotional limitations and has previously accepted their defensive patterns without demanding the growth or change that drove the avoidant away from you. Returning to this person feels like slipping into comfortable old clothes rather than risking the discomfort of new emotional territory that might expose their continued inability to sustain authentic, intimate connection or develop beyond their current emotional capacity. Understanding their return to exes means recognizing that these relationships were never truly concluded in the avoidant's mind. They were simply placed on hold while they explored other options, maintained as emotional insurance policies that could be activated when their current relationship failed, according to their unconscious sabotage timeline and defensive programming that prevents sustained intimate engagement. The ex often represents a person they idealize in retrospect, conveniently forgetting the reasons their original relationship failed while romanticizing the early connection and minimizing the patterns that made their previous partnership unsustainable. Distance and time allow them to rewrite history, transforming their ex into the one who got away rather than someone who left because of their emotional unavailability and systematic relationship sabotage. Their return to this ex serves multiple psychological functions. It provides immediate validation that they remain desirable despite losing you. It eliminates the vulnerability required to pursue genuinely new connections, and it allows them to avoid confronting their role in relationship failure by suggesting their ex represents their true emotional match, rather than acknowledging their consistent patterns across all partnerships that demonstrate their emotional limitations. The avoidant often contacts their ex with manufactured vulnerability about missing them or realizing their mistake in letting them go, using emotional appeals that feel authentic in the moment but actually serve their immediate need for validation and psychological comfort, rather than representing genuine emotional growth or recognition of what they lost through their defensive patterns and emotional cowardice. This X typically responds positively because they've been waiting in the wings, hoping for reunion and interpreting the avoidant's sporadic contact as signs of continued interest, rather than recognizing these communications as strategic relationship maintenance designed to ensure backup options remain available when primary relationships inevitably fail through their systematic sabotage and emotional unavailability. The reunion with their ex often follows familiar patterns, where initial excitement and idealization quickly give way to the same defensive behaviors, emotional distance, and relationship problems that characterize their original connection. The avoidant discovers that changing partners doesn't eliminate their attachment wounds or defensive programming that creates identical relationship dynamics, regardless of who they're with or how much they claim to have learned from past failures. Understanding why they turn to exes reveals that this choice represents emotional cowardice rather than genuine reconnection. Their attempt to avoid the self-reflection required to understand their patterns and their unconscious desire to prove that their relationship problems stem from incompatibility rather than their consistent emotional unavailability across all intimate partnerships they've systematically destroyed through defensive choices. The ex relationship also allows them to avoid the grief and accountability associated with losing you, providing immediate distraction from uncomfortable feelings about their role in relationship destruction, while offering the comfortable narrative that they've found their way back to their true love, rather than simply repeating familiar dysfunction with someone who accepts their limitations without demanding growth. Most significantly, their return to an ex demonstrates their fundamental inability to be alone with themselves and their emotions, their desperate need for external validation to avoid internal reflection, and their systematic avoidance of the personal growth that losing you could have catalyzed if they possessed the courage to face their attachment wounds, rather than fleeing into familiar relationship patterns that require nothing challenging from their emotional capacity. The ex also provides the avoidant with someone who won't compare unfavorably to the idealized memory of you that might develop over time, someone whose own flaws and limitations are already known and accepted, eliminating the possibility that reflection on what they lost might create uncomfortable recognition about the exceptional qualities you possessed that they systematically undervalued and rejected through their defensive behavior. The new supply who knows nothing. The avoidant frequently rebounds into relationships with completely new people who possess no knowledge of their emotional history, relationship patterns, or the sophisticated defensive strategies that destroyed their connection with you. This fresh supply provides the ultimate psychological reset where they can present idealized versions of themselves without accountability for past behavior or awareness of their consistent patterns across all intimate relationships that reveal their profound emotional limitations. This new person represents a blank slate onto which the avoidant can project their fantasy self, the emotionally available partner they wish they were, rather than the defensively unavailable person they consistently demonstrate themselves to be across relationships. The new supply's ignorance about their history allows them to maintain comfortable self-deceptions about their capacity for authentic intimacy and sustained emotional investment without confronting evidence of their repeated failures. Understanding their pursuit of new supply means recognizing that these relationships serve their need to avoid accountability for their patterns, their desire to feel like a different person without doing the internal work required for actual change, and their unconscious hope that a new partner who doesn't know their history won't trigger the same defensive responses that destroyed their relationship with you through systematic emotional withdrawal and relationship sabotage. The new supply typically possesses qualities that feel opposite to yours. If you were emotionally expressive, they seek someone more reserved. If you needed verbal affirmation, they find someone who doesn't require such communication. If you wanted commitment clarity, they choose someone comfortable with ambiguity. This contrast allows them to blame relationship failure on incompatibility, rather than recognizing their consistent emotional limitations that manifest regardless of partner characteristics. Their presentation to new supply involves carefully curated versions of their relationship history, where they position themselves as victims of previous partners' emotional excess, unreasonable demands, or incompatible attachment styles. They rewrite their past to eliminate their accountability while creating narratives that justify their defensive patterns as reasonable responses to previous relationship dysfunction caused by others, rather than their own emotional immaturity. The avoidant often love bombs their new supply with intensity and emotional availability that you never experienced, not because they've developed greater capacity for intimacy, but because the novelty and lack of established patterns temporarily override their defensive programming. This initial intensity creates false hope that they've changed when they've simply found someone who doesn't yet trigger their attachment wounds through familiarity and emotional investment. This new relationship follows predictable trajectories where their initial emotional availability gradually diminishes as familiarity increases, where their defensive patterns reassert themselves as intimacy deepens, and where they eventually demonstrate the same emotional unavailability that characterized their relationship with you and every previous partnership they've systematically sabotaged through their attachment fears and defensive withdrawal patterns. The new supplier's lack of knowledge about their patterns initially works in the avoidance favor, but eventually becomes relationship liability as they realize they're experiencing identical dynamics to previous partners without understanding why. The avoidant's consistent behavior across relationships reveals that changing partners doesn't eliminate their attachment wounds or defensive programming that creates relationship destruction regardless of who provides the love and patience they systematically reject. Understanding why they pursue new supply reveals their desperate need to feel different without becoming different, their attempt to escape their relationship history without learning from it, and their unconscious belief that they can outrun their patterns by constantly seeking partners who don't yet know the truth about their emotional limitations and capacity for sustained intimate connection that remains fundamentally underdeveloped despite their age and relationship experience. The new supply relationship also serves their need for validation that they remain desirable despite losing you, providing ego repair through someone's fresh interest and attraction that confirms their worth without requiring them to confront their role in relationship failure or their consistent patterns of emotional unavailability and defensive sabotage that destroy every connection they establish with emotionally healthy partners. Most tragically, their pursuit of new supply demonstrates their fundamental inability to learn from relationship failures, their systematic avoidance of the self-reflection that could facilitate genuine growth, and their commitment to repeating identical patterns while expecting different outcomes, simply because they've changed the other person rather than changing themselves through authentic therapeutic work and emotional development that would require uncomfortable vulnerability and sustained courage. The new supply also allows them to temporarily escape the guilt and self-awareness that might emerge from sitting alone with the reality of what they lost in you, providing immediate distraction through the excitement of new connection that eliminates space for meaningful reflection about their behavioral patterns and their role in destroying relationships that offer genuine potential for healing and satisfaction if they possess capacity for sustained emotional investment, the emotional placeholder, anyone available. The avoidant often turns to whoever happens to be convenient and emotionally available in their immediate vicinity, treating human connections like interchangeable emotional utilities that serve their temporary need for validation, distraction, or ego repair without any genuine investment in the specific person providing these psychological services. This placeholder can be anyone: co-workers who show interest, friends who've expressed attraction, acquaintances from their social circle, or even strangers from dating apps who require nothing beyond surface-level interaction and temporary companionship. This pattern reveals the avoidant's profound emotional emptiness and their inability to distinguish between meaningful connection and simple human contact, between authentic relationships and temporary distractions that fill the void without requiring vulnerability or genuine emotional investment. The placeholder's identity matters less than their availability and willingness to provide immediate attention that helps the avoidant avoid uncomfortable feelings about losing you and their role in relationship destruction. Understanding their use of placeholders means recognizing that these connections serve purely functional purposes. They eliminate loneliness without requiring intimacy, provide validation without demanding reciprocity, and create the appearance of moving forward without requiring actual emotional growth or self-reflection about patterns that consistently destroy their relationships with people who offer genuine love and sustained emotional investment. The placeholder often feels confused about their role in the avoidance life, interpreting their attention as genuine interest rather than recognizing themselves as convenient distraction from uncomfortable emotions. The avoidant refuses to process authentically. these people become casualties of the avoidance emotional unavailability, providing care and attention to someone whose capacity for reciprocity remains fundamentally compromised by their attachment wounds. Their pursuit of placeholders demonstrates the avoidant's desperate need to avoid being alone with themselves and their feelings, their systematic escape from the self-reflection that losing you should have triggered, and their preference for any human contact over the solitude that might force them to confront their emotional limitations and consistent relationship patterns that destroy every connection they establish. The avoidance relationship with placeholders typically lacks depth, authenticity, or genuine emotional investment. These connections serve as emotional band-aids that temporarily cover wounds, requiring actual healing through therapeutic intervention and personal growth work. The placeholder provides surface-level comfort, while the avoidant continues avoiding the internal work necessary for developing capacity for authentic, intimate connection. Most insidiously, the avoidant often treats placeholders poorly because they unconsciously resent these people for not being you, while simultaneously resenting you for making them feel anything significant enough to require such desperate distraction. The placeholder becomes target for displaced anger about their own emotional limitations and their inability to sustain relationships with people who deserve better treatment than their defensive patterns allow them to provide. The placeholder phase often includes multiple overlapping connections as the avoidant hedges their emotional bets, maintaining several sources of validation and distraction simultaneously to ensure they never experience the uncomfortable solitude that might force authentic grief processing and meaningful self-examination about their role in relationship failures. Understanding their use of placeholders reveals their fundamental inability to value human connection beyond its utility for their immediate psychological comfort, their systematic objectification of people whose only crime is being available when the avoidant needs distraction, and their profound emotional immaturity that prevents them from recognizing the harm they inflict through their casual treatment of others' emotions. The placeholder strategy also demonstrates the avoidant's continued emotional unavailability despite losing you. They haven't learned anything from relationship failure, haven't developed greater capacity for genuine connection, and haven't recognized their patterns because they've immediately escaped into superficial connections that require nothing challenging from their limited emotional range and defensive programming. Most significantly, their turn to placeholders reveals that you were likely treated as placeholder yourself at some point in their relationship history, that their capacity for genuine emotional investment remains fundamentally compromised, and that their current treatment of others reflects the same emotional poverty that destroyed your relationship, rather than representing temporary grief response that might eventually resolve into healthy relationship capacity. The fantasy they can never have. The avoidant frequently fixates on idealized connections with people who remain perpetually unavailable, unattainable, or uninterested in them, pursuing fantasy relationships that can never materialize into authentic partnerships, requiring sustained emotional investment and vulnerable, intimate engagement. These fantasy figures serve their psychological need to remain emotionally engaged without risking the genuine vulnerability that real relationships demand from emotionally mature adults capable of reciprocal care and sustained intimate presence. This fantasy often involves someone from their past who rejected them, someone currently in committed relationships who remains emotionally off limits, or someone whose life circumstances make genuine partnership impossible. The avoidant becomes obsessed with these unattainable connections, precisely because their unavailability prevents the relationship from progressing to stages where their emotional limitations would be exposed and their defensive patterns would destroy the idealized fantasy. Understanding their fantasy fixation means recognizing that these impossible connections serve their need to feel emotionally alive and romantically engaged while protecting themselves from the actual intimacy that would trigger their attachment wounds and defensive withdrawal patterns. The fantasy allows them to experience longing, desire, and romantic feelings without risking the vulnerability that genuine reciprocal relationships require from both partners. The fantasy figure typically possesses qualities they've idealized beyond realistic human capacity: emotional availability combined with perfect respect for boundaries, passionate intensity combined with complete understanding of their need for space, total acceptance combined with continued challenge and excitement that prevents the boredom they associate with relationship, stability, and predictability. Their pursuit of fantasy connections demonstrates their continued inability to engage with actual human beings who possess normal emotional needs, realistic expectations, and the imperfections that characterize authentic relationships. The fantasy requires nothing from them, while allowing them to maintain the romantic self-image of someone capable of deep feeling and passionate love, despite their consistent emotional unavailability. The avoidant often compares you unfavorably to their fantasy figure, using this impossible standard to justify their inability to appreciate what you offered while avoiding accountability for their role in relationship destruction. The fantasy becomes convenient explanation for why you weren't enough, rather than forcing them to confront their incapacity for genuine intimacy with any real person who requires reciprocal emotional investment. This fantasy fixation also serves their need to avoid genuine grief about losing you by redirecting their emotional energy toward impossible pursuits that distract from uncomfortable feelings about their choices and their consistent patterns of relationship destruction. The fantasy provides emotionally safe outlet for feelings that feel too dangerous to experience authentically or process through therapeutic reflection and personal growth work. The avoidance fantasy often includes elaborate scenarios about how this impossible relationship would unfold if circumstances were different, creating detailed emotional narratives that substitute for actual relationship participation and genuine human connection. These fantasies provide psychological comfort while requiring zero vulnerability or actual emotional risk. Understanding their fantasy fixation reveals their fundamental preference for imaginary perfect relationships over real, imperfect partnerships, their inability to tolerate the normal challenges and compromises that authentic intimacy requires, and their systematic avoidance of the vulnerability that genuine human connection demands from emotionally mature adults capable of sustained reciprocal care. The fantasy also demonstrates their continued emotional immaturity and their inability to distinguish between authentic love and idealized projection, between genuine connection and romantic fantasy that serves their psychological comfort without requiring the difficult emotional work that real relationships demand from both partners. Most devastatingly, their fantasy fixation reveals that you are competing against impossible standards from the beginning, that their capacity to appreciate real human beings remains fundamentally compromised by their preference for idealized impossibilities, and that their relationship failures stem from their inability to engage authentically with actual people rather than from any inadequacy in the partners who offered them genuine love and sustained emotional availability. The fantasy figure allows them to maintain their identity as someone capable of deep feeling and romantic passion while avoiding the vulnerability that expressing such feelings toward available partners would require, protecting them from the rejection and disappointment they unconsciously expect from any relationship that progresses beyond fantasy into authentic intimate engagement requiring sustained emotional presence. The casual connections that require nothing. The avoidant gravitates towards superficial relationships and casual encounters that demand zero emotional investment, vulnerability, or authentic self-revelation, seeking connections with people who accept surface-level interaction without expecting or desiring the emotional depth that characterizes genuine intimate partnerships. These casual connections provide the illusion of human contact while protecting the avoidant from the emotional exposure and sustained presence that losing you should have taught them to value if they possessed capacity for genuine growth and self-reflection. These connections typically manifest through dating apps designed for casual encounters, social activities that facilitate brief interactions without ongoing commitment, or situationships with people who explicitly state they want nothing serious and therefore won't demand the emotional availability that the avoidant cannot provide. The casualness serves their need to feel connected to humanity while avoiding the vulnerability that authentic relationships require from emotionally mature adults. Understanding their pursuit of casual connections means recognizing that these relationships serve their desperate need to avoid genuine intimacy while maintaining the appearance of romantic engagement and emotional availability. They can participate in physical intimacy, social companionship, and surface level emotional exchange without risking the authentic vulnerability that genuine partnership demands from someone whose attachment wounds make sustained emotional investment feel psychologically dangerous. The avoidant often maintains multiple casual connections simultaneously, creating emotional diversification that prevents any single person from becoming significant enough to trigger their attachment fears and defensive withdrawal patterns. This strategy allows them to experience connection without dependency, intimacy without vulnerability, and companionship without the emotional investment that characterize their relationship with you. Their casual connections typically involve people who cannot or will not demand more than surface level engagement. Individuals focused on their own lives who appreciate casual companionship, people recovering from their own relationship traumas who avoid depth for their own reasons, or emotionally unavailable individuals whose limitations match the avoidant's incapacity for genuine reciprocal care and sustained intimate presence. The avoidant often presents these casual connections as evidence of their emotional health and relationship capacity, claiming their ability to maintain multiple light relationships demonstrates their social competence while actually revealing their continued inability to sustain genuine emotional investment with any single person who requires reciprocal care and authentic vulnerability from their partners. Their pursuit of casualness also serves their need to avoid the grief and self-reflection that losing you should have triggered, providing constant distraction through rotating cast of interchangeable people who prevent them from experiencing the solitude necessary for meaningful personal growth and authentic processing of their relationship patterns and emotional limitations. Understanding their casual connection strategy reveals their fundamental fear of genuine intimacy, their systematic avoidance of emotional depth that might trigger their attachment wounds, and their preference for quantity of connections over quality of relationship that could provide the satisfaction they claim to desire, but consistently avoid through their defensive choices. The casual approach also demonstrates their continued emotional immaturity and their inability to recognize that authentic satisfaction requires vulnerability, that genuine connection demands sustained emotional investment, and that meaningful relationships necessitate the very emotional risks they systematically avoid through their superficial interaction patterns and defensive relationship strategies. Most significantly, their turn to casual connections reveals that they learned nothing from losing you, that their capacity for genuine intimacy remains fundamentally undeveloped, and that their relationship patterns will continue destroying every connection that threatens to become meaningful enough to require the sustained emotional presence and authentic vulnerability they find psychologically impossible to maintain. The casual connections also serve their ego by providing validation that they remain desirable and socially competent despite their relationship failures, offering external confirmation of their worth. without requiring them to confront their internal emptiness and their profound inability to sustain the genuine, intimate partnerships that characterize emotionally healthy adults capable of reciprocal care. The friends who enable their dysfunction. The avoidant surrounds themselves with friends whose own emotional limitations, relationship failures, or psychological dysfunction normalize and enable their patterns, seeking social environments that reinforce their defensive narratives about relationships while protecting them from accountability for their consistent relationship destruction and emotional unavailability. These enabling friends provide the validation and support that allows the avoidant to avoid genuine self-reflection while maintaining comfortable self-deceptions about their capacity for authentic intimacy. These friends typically share the avoidant's cynical perspectives about love, relationships, and emotional vulnerability, creating echo chambers where their defensive patterns get celebrated as emotional sophistication rather than recognized as profound psychological dysfunction requiring therapeutic intervention. The avoidant seeks people who confirm their worldview that relationships are temporary, emotional needs are excessive, and commitment is psychological imprisonment rather than authentic partnership. Understanding their friendship choices means recognizing that these relationships serve their need to avoid accountability for their patterns, their desire for social validation that protects their ego while preventing growth, and their systematic escape from people who might challenge their defensive narratives or encourage the personal development work that genuine healing requires from someone with profound attachment wounds. The enabling friends often include other avoidants who celebrate emotional distance as strength, people with their own relationship failures who bond over shared cynicism about love, or individuals whose own psychological limitations make them unable to recognize or challenge the avoidance dysfunction. These friendships reinforce rather than challenge the patterns that consistently destroy their intimate relationships. Their friend group typically provides support that feels validating, but actually enables continued dysfunction. They help the avoidant rationalize their behavior, justify their relationship failures, and maintain comfortable narratives about their ex-partners being too needy, too emotional, or too demanding, rather than recognizing their own emotional limitations as the consistent factor across all their failed relationships. The avoidant often presents distorted versions of their relationship history to these friends, positioning themselves as victims of others' emotional excess, while minimizing their own emotional unavailability, defensive patterns, and systematic relationship sabotage. The friends accept these narratives without challenge because confronting the truth would require uncomfortable conversations that might threaten their own comfortable self-deceptions about relationships. Their friendship circles also typically exclude people with healthy relationship patterns or secure attachment styles whose presence might highlight the avoidance dysfunction through comparison, and whose perspectives might challenge the comfortable narratives that protect the avoidant from genuine self-awareness and meaningful accountability for their consistent relationship destruction. Understanding their choice of enabling friends reveals their systematic avoidance of growth-promoting relationships, their preference for validation over development, and their desperate need to maintain psychological comfort rather than pursuing the challenging personal work that could heal their attachment wounds and develop their capacity for genuine, intimate connection. The enabling friends also serve their need to feel superior through comparison to others with similar or worse relationship patterns, providing the avoidant with social proof that their dysfunction is normal rather than recognizing it as requiring therapeutic intervention and genuine commitment to personal growth and emotional development. Most destructively, these friendships prevent the avoidant from receiving the honest feedback, caring confrontation, and genuine support that could facilitate their healing and growth. The enabling friends protect the avoidant's ego while ensuring they remain trapped in patterns that prevent authentic satisfaction meaningful connection, and the emotional fulfillment they unconsciously crave but systematically avoid through defensive choices. The friend group often celebrates the avoidant's independence and emotional distance as admirable qualities, rather than recognizing these patterns as profound limitations that prevent genuine intimate partnership and authentic human connection. This celebration reinforces their defensive programming while preventing the vulnerability and emotional risk taking that genuine healing requires.